Hey everyone, welcome to Informed Dissent, a news podcast that brings you dispatches from the gender culture war. I am Ben Appel, the author of Cis White Gay: The Making of a Gender Heretic, which will be published on November 4th and is now available for pre-order where books are sold. I'm here with my co-hosts, author and needle felter, Lisa Sellen Davis, gender clinic whistleblower and co-executive director of LGBT Courage Coalition, Jamie Reed, the disenchanted transsexual Corey Cohn, and we are missing Sarah Mittermeier today. She's out, but we are joined by Leor Sapir, definitely a friend of the pod and all of us. Leor Sapir is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He holds a PhD in political science from Boston College, and he completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Program on Constitutional Government at Harvard University. Since joining the Manhattan Institute, he's become a widely recognized thought leader on topics related to pediatric gender medicine, education policy, and culture. He's a regular contributor to City Journal. You should read his articles, his trove of articles, because they're brilliant. And he has co-authored amicus briefs for lawsuits on parental rights and education, and is lead author of an important letter to the editor in the peer-reviewed academic journal, The Archives of Sexual Behavior on, quote, rapid onset gender dysphoria. So welcome, Leor. Right before we started recording, typically I do a lot of different headlines. There's one major headline, so we're going to kind of get right into the conversation. On Wednesday, the Supreme Court announced that it had ruled 6-3 to uphold Tennessee's ban on puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for minors. So it ruled that the Equal Rights Amendment, the Equal Rights, what is it? The clause
Civil Rights Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment.
Of the 14th Amendment did not apply here. And that ban can stand. And so in the 20 plus states, this protects the 20 plus states that have passed bans. It protects those and will allow those to be upheld. And then we'll kind of see how everything unfolds from here. But we want to get right into it. So, Leor, welcome. You were beginning to say something before we started recording, and then we said, wait, don't talk yet. Let's start this conversation.
I don't remember what it was.
Well, we were talking about the Nicholas Confessore article about the Skrmetti case, which we can get into, but before we do that, because I do want to ask Leor about that, I want to have Leor go into the nitty-gritty of this decision, because I think it's more complex and narrower than just now everybody can ban this. That's not actually what the case was about, and it's not actually what it says. So can you explain for the people who don't spend all day thinking about this? I guess there are 6 or 7 people in America who don't spend all day thinking about this. What was actually at stake in the case? What was the question at the heart of this case?
Well, the question at the heart of the case is whether HB1, which is the law passed by Tennessee, is unconstitutional, whether it infringes upon the constitutionally guaranteed rights of people in the state of Tennessee in a way that violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. As is often the case with cases that have a constitutional dimension that bubble up from the lower courts, the Supreme Court granted cert, agreed to hear the case, and decided that no, there is no grounds for saying that laws that restrict these interventions based on age and medical purpose, that's the way the court framed it, infringe upon equal protection rights. So one question that everybody's asking is, well, how narrow is the ruling? What's its applicability? What does it mean for the states, for lower courts? I think that's actually fairly straightforward. What the court said is that these laws, when they are challenged on equal protection grounds, lower courts have to apply the lowest standard of judicial scrutiny, which is known as rational basis. And if you want, I can kind of give a very brief explainer of how equal protection analysis works. But the bottom line is, under the rational basis standard, a state, all a state has to do to have its law survive in court is show that there's some conceivable justification. It doesn't even have to be the actual justification that animated lawmakers. It's just some conceivable justification for the law, and that there is just a rational fit, meaning some kind of rational relationship between the end that the law wants to achieve and the means it proposes for achieving it. So it's a very, very permissive standard of review, and it's, a law really has to be outrageous or egregious for a lower court to say that even under a rational basis review, a law like this wouldn't survive.
So the other layers, so you're saying rational basis is kind of the simplest hurdle to jump over. Are
Right.
there two more? So is heightened scrutiny one of those?
Right. So maybe just a few words kind of on our constitutional history, because it's relevant for cases like these. In the beginning of the 20th century, the court system, the federal court system, was kind of pushing back against progressive era legislation on the economic front. And the court was saying laws that regulate economics are going to be subjected to a higher level of scrutiny by us, by the courts, because they infringe upon fundamental rights of economic association. In 1937, the court, in a case called Caroline Products, the court had a famous footnote in which it basically said, from now on, we're going to apply the higher level of scrutiny to laws that draw classifications or impinge upon the interests and rights of discrete and insular minorities. And of course, they had African Americans in mind. And sure enough, 15 years later, 16 years later, we get Brown versus Board of Education. Fast forward about a decade or so, and you start to see the cases dealing with claims of sex discrimination. On the grounds, originally, the argument was that discrimination against women, meaning laws that said men can do this, but women can't, are like laws that discriminate on the basis of race. So a lot of American legal history is development through analogy. And those analogies can be more persuasive, they could be less persuasive. And of course, the more abstract the analogy becomes, usually the less persuasive it is. And I think what we're seeing unfold now with regard to trans issues is, again, another example of the use of analogy, in this case, an analogy that simply doesn't fit within our constitutional jurisprudence. And I think that that's kind of what the court was trying to get at. But initially, the Supreme Court agreed that sex is like race. A few years later, it walked that back a little bit and said, no, wait a second, there are actually relevant differences between men and women in a way that we can't say in terms of, whites and blacks. And so we need a third tier. We need something in between strict scrutiny and rational basis review. And that's when they came up with the term intermediate review. And so if strict scrutiny is applied to laws that have a suspect classification, that's another legal term. Intermediate review is applied to laws that have a quasi-suspect classification, and sex is a quasi-suspect classification in American jurisprudence, in American federal law. There are some, law professors who will tell you that all of that is bullshit, pardon my French, that there's no such thing as intermediate scrutiny. Intermediate scrutiny, they'll argue, is nothing more than judges doing strict scrutiny, but allowing themselves to do it without as much rigor and legal reasoning. I think there's something to that objection, but let's just assume that there is this third in-between tier. So that's what the ACLU and the Biden administration were hoping that the Supreme Court would do here. And their strategy was a little bit more clever, I think, than people give them credit for. They were saying something to the effect of, look, you might agree with Tennessee that there's a reasonable case to be made against these interventions in kids, or against imposing some restrictions, all restrictions, whatever the case may be. But that is a question of fact that has to be adjudicated in the lower courts. And the only way the courts will adjudicate that question in the first place is if they have to, because they're looking at these laws under a more exacting legal standard.
Got it. Okay.
So they were basically trying to send the Supreme Court the message of, look, you don't have to decide whether Tennessee is right. You don't have to decide whether these interventions are a medical scandal or life-saving medically necessary care. But if the courts are to decide those questions, they can only reach those questions within a context of intermediate scrutiny. So all you have to do, Supreme Court judges, is just agree with us that that standard applies. Now, of course, they knew that if the Supreme Court approves of that standard, liberal judges in the lower courts will use that to strike down all of these laws. They know that, of course. That's kind of the unstated premise of their petition.
So to pick up on a couple things you said, but one about the analogy, because the analogy that not only came up during the arguments, but came up with me in a conversation I had with a very famous constitutional law scholar who will remain unnamed, is that the analogy is race segregated bathrooms, and the sex discrimination argument is the but-for argument. So the reason they won in Bostock, in which it was found that it was a form of sex discrimination to, for instance, fire a transgender woman for dressing, quote unquote, as a woman, is because but for the sex of the person, that would have been okay. If a woman had worn those clothes, she would not have been fired, but a male person identifying as a woman wearing those clothes would be fired. And so the ACLU was trying to argue in this case that a natal girl could get estrogens, but for this transgender girl's sex could not get them. Although that is not true, that you can get estrogens to align yourself with the purpose of your sex. You can get estrogens to control your period or birth control. I guess, unless I'm wrong, I don't know of cases, although it is true for natal males. They can get a testosterone prescription to bring them, if they are, if they have whatever it's called,
Gonadism,
hypoandrogenism. Okay, sorry, this is very unprofessional of me to not know the name of this, but they can get a prescription. A natal male with low levels of testosterone.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Can get a prescription for testosterone to bring his body in line with the stereotypes associated with his sex.
Well, no, hold on.
I don't know that that's the reason.
No, that's not right. That's not the clinical rationale.
All right, it's a condition. It's a diagnosable condition, even though it's not necessarily. Well, this is what Norman Spack told me, right? When he was treating his first patient, he thought, oh, I have these hypogonadal males who I give testosterone to help them be in line with, to have their levels aligned with typical males. No, yes. But anyway, the point is that for the most part, the but-for clause does not stand when it comes to treating minors, right? What we established during the hearing was they're not getting them, that they're being denied for all kids, not just based on their sex.
Right, that's right. And I think that the court's argument that this is based on age and, more importantly, medical purpose is a very difficult argument to contend with for the dissents. And I just, frank admission, I'm just getting through Sotomayor's dissent. I'm almost all the way through it. I'm just stunned by the poor reasoning here.
Thank you.
It's not clear to me if, and I'll say why in a minute, because it speaks directly to the point you're making. I don't know if it's that Sotomayor is just so ideologically blinded by kind of her fixation on, on trans kids and stuff like that, or if this is motivated reasoning, or she's just maybe not the sharpest knife in the, in the drawer. I don't know. But some of the reasoning here is just stunningly bad. And it really kind of, I've seen graduate papers, or I should say undergraduate papers that are better. So let me give a couple examples.
And Corey has some too. Corey, you've been tweeting out.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Corey, why don't you start? Curious what you found.
Well, there are a number of things that I thought were eyebrow raising. One of them is that maybe the most important one is that a lot of her reasoning depends on the assumption that boys can become more boy-like and girls can become more girl-like,
right,
through the administration of HRT, and that she was sympathetic to the plaintiffs because she says if boys can take testosterone to become more boy-like, how come girls cannot take testosterone to become more boy-like? That's sex discrimination. But there's no girls are girls and boys are boys. It's not a continuum.
Right.
So her main legal argument depends on there being a continuum of sex. And then she goes in deeper for an analogy later where she says, well, take the case where you have a girl who has excessive hair growth, hirsutism. And she doesn't like the appearance of the hair growth, and she wants to deal with that. Well, there's an underlying metabolic or endocrine disorder that's a symptom. The root cause is not the hair. That's a symptom of some other deeper medical disorder. So the treatment for it is not a cosmetic treatment, but all of her argument depends on it being a cosmetic treatment for it to make any sense, at all. And it doesn't even pass a simple scratch test. It's baffling. That's what struck me.
Also, Corey, you talked about the way Sotomayor dissented, which was not in dissent, but
yeah, so
in sadness.
Yeah, this is maybe a norms change. This isn't something that goes back to the origin of the court, but I think it's true to say that the production of as many dissents as we see today is not even something that goes back historically. However, there's some degree of collegiality on the court where they say, respectfully, I dissent. Respectfully, I dissent. This is sort of like saying thank you after somebody gives you a piece of pie. So what Sotomayor said is, in sadness, I dissent, which is like when somebody hands you a piece of cherry pie and you go, I just don't like cherry pie. It's not very nice. So she's throwing a rock into this norm, saying, wow, this majority opinion is just trash. But this is the way that Supreme Court justices trash talk each other. And actually, if you go into the concurrences, Alito's concurrence and Thomas's concurrence, there's a lot of trash talking of other justices in the footnotes, which is sort of, I don't know, amusing.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not the first time we've seen this. I mean, maybe one of the latest and most dramatic examples of this trash talking was actually in the 2015 Obergefell decision on marriage.
Oh, yeah.
If you read Scalia's dissent there, I mean, he just tears into the majority. I think he one time, he likens their reasoning to the mystical aphorisms of a fortune cookie. That's how he put it. So it's certainly not the first time that we see this from the Supremes, but yes, you're right. I mean, it is. I mean, in fairness, Sotomayor's dissent in particular is it's shockingly dumb. I just don't know how else to put it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the court majority has just said this law creates distinctions on the basis of a medical condition, a medical treatment. And the only way in which Sotomayor can get around that obvious argument is to just ignore, just to pretend that the medical issues, medical conditions are not at stake here. So just give you an example. So here's what she says. This is on page 11 of Sotomayor's dissent, okay? what does it mean in practice? Meaning this this construction of sex discrimination. Simply that sex determines access to the covered medication. Physicians in Tennessee can prescribe hormones and puberty blockers to help a male child, but not a female child, look more like a boy. And to help a female child, but not a male child, look more like a girl. First of all, what doctor is prescribing puberty blockers to boys to make them look more like boys?
Well,
I don't think that's even...
I'm going to defend that.
Go ahead.
So here's what I think she means.
Okay.
Precocious puberty has one side effect, which is to cause the growth plates to fuse sooner, which causes people with, including boys, precocious puberty, to have a shorter stature. I think that's what she means.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. So maybe that is what she means. But of course, you've just explained why the analogy is inappropriate, because there's a different condition. And so then the question is, okay, is there what's the diagnosis of this condition? What is its kind of, what is the natural course of the disease? What are the risks and benefits of giving puberty blockers versus the risk of and benefits of not giving? Those are the questions that doctors are obviously, or should obviously be concerned with. But her argument is, no, we don't have to get into any of that stuff. It's the mere fact that doctors will take sex into account in how and to whom they prescribe certain drugs. That in and of itself creates a constitutional infringement, or at least a presumptive constitutional infringement, which is just, again, it's like me telling you to describe Newtonian physics in 2-syllable words. It's just shockingly dumb. That's not how medicine works. And that's not how lawmakers and judges should think about their role as policymakers or as regulators when they're talking about medicine. So then she goes on, the next paragraph, she says, like any other statute that turns on inconsistency with the protected characteristic, SB1 plainly classifies on the basis of sex. A simple analogy illustrates the point. Suppose Tennessee prohibits minors from attending any services, rituals, or assemblies if done for the purpose of allowing the minor to identify with a purported identity inconsistent with the minor's religion. No one would seriously dispute that that rule classifies on the basis of religion. Whether the law prohibits a minor from attending any particular religious service turns on the minor's religion. Okay, but what's the obvious difference here? It's that you are not talking about a situation in which this is just a matter of autonomous belief or autonomous religious practice. You're talking about a third party, doctors, prescribing medications. It's not the same thing. And in fact, I think, and I said this today, I think on X, that this paragraph shows pretty clearly that Sotomayor, probably because she has been led to think this way by the ACLU and the Department of Justice, sees these medications as nothing more than an expression of individual autonomy. She sees doctors as nothing more than facilitators for self-expression. In other words, this is a perfect example of how you reduce medicine to consumerism.
Yes.
And we already know that even though religion is not an immutable characteristic, it's still protected. And can you talk a little bit, Leora, about how they did or did not address trans as a protected class? Sex is a quasi-suspect class, but trans as part of that, the hope I think among people like in the ACLU was that they would come out with this.
Right.
Trans as a protected class. Can you explain?
Yeah, okay, so let me say a couple words about that. So first of all, I think the ACLU and the Biden administration wisely anticipated that is the least likely of their claims to succeed with a conservative leaning court. I think for them, kind of the ideal outcome from this case, not the best possible, but the best simply, would have been for the court to once and for all declare that transgender is a protected status and eligible for constitutional protection like other protected statuses. But I think they also recognize that the chance of that happening was very, very small. And so that's why they went with this whole extremely bizarre argument about this being sex discrimination. And that's why so many of the really weird hypotheticals that Sotomayor gets into, that you also heard during the oral arguments and you saw in the briefings, they so much of what makes this case so utterly weird is because they were trying basically to use the sex discrimination construction or angle to litigate their case. And so what I find interesting here is that there's a bit of a disagreement within the majority between Roberts and the justices who joined him. I think there were 3 who joined him in full and 2 who authored concurrences, those being, I think, Alito and Thomas.
I think it was a
maybe
3-3-3 split because Barrett, I think, joined.
You might be right.
Yeah.
You might be right. Yeah. But there is a kind of a debate on this question of whether transgender is a protected status. And, you know, the majority, the Roberts opinion basically says it's irrelevant, right? Because these laws don't draw any distinctions on the basis of transgender status or sex, for that matter. They classify on the basis of age and medical condition. Alito is not happy with that. Justice Alito says, you know, we have to address the elephant in the room here, which is that, yes, of course, there's a kind of a classification based on transgender status. I'm not saying I agree with him. I'm just saying this is his way of thinking about it. And we need to explain why, even if the lawmakers had transgender status in mind when passing this law, that is not fatal to their law because transgender status, according to Alito, is not a suspect or a quasi-suspect class. And Justice Barrett says something very similar.
Yeah, can I quote Barrett here?
Go ahead.
So I think Roberts was being very kind and not even including this in the decision, because she says here, they're talking about this as a quasi-suspect class. I'm going to quote from this. The American Psychological Association similarly uses the phrase transgender youth as an umbrella term to describe varied groups with many diverse gender experiences. And that's from a American Psychological Association Curie brief, or amicus brief rather. So she continues, underscoring the point, plaintiff's counsel acknowledged at oral argument that there are people who fall within a transgender identity who may not fit into a binary identity. The boundaries of the group, in other words, are not defined by an easily ascertainable characteristic that is fixed and consistent across groups. John Roberts could have used Chase Strangio's own words to say, yeah, this is never going to be a quasi-suspect class. Like like in their words, in the plaintiff's words, this can never be a class. And I think this is Barrett saying, you know, we could have done this, and maybe next time we will, and we don't even have to ask the other side.
Right.
Like the plaintiffs have explained it. It can never be a quasi-suspect class.
That's right. And that speaks to something also very interesting. And I mentioned something about this on X yesterday as well, which is that the kind of the transgender movement's own redefinition of the core terms in this debate, sex, gender identity, transgender, I think has made an argument or an appeal to the courts for a designation of suspect or quasi-suspect classification all but impossible.
Yes.
And I think Chase Strangio in some ways represents that problem.
Yes.
Because Strangio is, of course, a very, very committed devotee to this new kind of queer theory inspired understanding of human nature. And if you think about how transgender is defined today, meaning the definition given even by mainstream organizations like the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, makes it indistinguishable from kind of garden variety gender nonconformity. I mean, they like saying being transgender is not the same as being gender nonconforming, but their own definitions explicitly say that the two are the same thing. And if that's the case, you know, who among us doesn't technically fall under the category of transgender? It simply becomes a matter of, do I want to be transgender? Maybe on one day I do, maybe on another day I don't. it no longer carries the meaning that it used, that when the word transsexual was used decades ago, that carried a particular meaning. It meant somebody who takes medical steps to try to pass or look like, resemble a person of the opposite sex. But under the current definition of transgender, with its underlying concepts and new definitions of sex, gender, and gender identity, we're all transgender now. It's just simply a matter of, do we describe ourselves that way or not? And that's a decision we can make in our own head, and it can change, on occasion, back and forth. And so under the Supreme Court's own jurisprudence of when you designate a minority, eligible for that, for kind of heightened judicial protection, if you look at the criteria that the court has historically applied, and maybe let's just do that for just a minute, because I think it's very important, and this question is going to come back, I think, at some point. So first of all, it has to possess an immutable or highly visible trait, right? But under the current definition, that simply cannot be the case. Whereas if you think about 30, 40 years ago, how the term transsexual was understood, the highly visible trait, is almost certainly that these women are really male, right? It's pretty obvious. In fact, if you go back to all of the employment discrimination lawsuits in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, which is not the jurisprudence, but the case law out of which a lot of the current transgender case law grew, it's widely understood there that the transsexual plaintiffs are men who are severely gender nonconforming and wish to be recognized socially as women. That's how the judges understood them. That's how even the plaintiffs' lawyers describe them. So that alone makes the test fail. Another criteria is that they have to have been historically discriminated against or subjected to prejudice or hostility or stigma. Sure, of course, you could find many examples, I'm sure, of people who are severely gender nonconforming, who want to present as the opposite sex, experiencing
well, wait, don't you have to find that in law? Isn't the point that you have to find the discrimination somehow spelled out in law?
So, I mean, the gold standard would be, yes, there has to be a history of de jure discrimination.
Okay.
Right? And of course, the experience here of race in American history is the guiding experience.
And sex. I
And
could
sex,
own
although,
a bank account.
right.
I would have to ask permission to get divorced or to get a passport or things like that. So
That's right. So these are de jure forms of discrimination on the basis of sex. By the way, a fun fact that not everybody knows is that the laws that were challenged in the 60s and 70s that classified explicitly on the basis of sex were progressive era legislation passed by women's advocates in the progressive era that sought to protect them from kind of going into the public sphere and what it would be like for them to work and so forth. So it was very interesting that kind of the feminists of the 1960s were really in argument with the feminists of the 1920s. But in any case, you're right. Presumably you could have examples where there's such pervasive social discrimination, where it's kind of where it's just understood that there's kind of a social minority that experiences severe social discrimination, even if it's not officially recognized in law. But yes, I mean, courts are much more reluctant in those scenarios to say this group has been historically discriminated against. A third criteria is that the group has to be powerless in the political process. This is actually, I think, maybe the most important point. So the test in legal terms is that it's a discrete and insular minority. And of course, the experience of race is, again, the gold standard here. I don't think anybody would deny that African Americans, both before the Civil War and even after, during the era of Reconstruction and Jim Crow, were politically powerless. That was the whole point of Jim Crow, was to leave them politically powerless. I equally don't think that anybody reasonable could argue that people who identify as trans, or maybe let's be a little bit more narrow here, transgender rights advocates or activists, are politically powerless. If you think about how many Americans identify that way, And you think about the fact that their interests are not only kind of grudgingly represented, but for a decade or more have been front and center in the kind of political agendas of the Democratic Party, of most of corporate media, of academia with almost no exception, corporations, Hollywood, the cultural industry, medicine, almost the entire medical establishment. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. In fact, the only institution in American society that did not adopt their claims and demands uncritically was the Republican Party. And so I think there's a kind of a good case to be made that if there's one obvious test criterion that kind of the transgender fails.
I'm just representing
You're
institutionalization,
Yes.
right? Like, I'm just showing you that pride, but that this group's interests are not only represented in politics, but in big tech, and it's actually impossible to go anywhere without the largest corporations celebrating pride, even though we're hearing a lot in the news about this corporation isn't doing pride this year. I'm still getting rainbows with my Zoom and my Microsoft Word and at the bank. So yeah. I'm sorry, I needed you guys to taste the rainbow.
But yeah, I mean, so you can see that on each one of these criteria, it's very difficult to argue with a straight face that transgender people, to kind of use a familiar mode of reasoning, are like women, are like African Americans, are like disabled people. It's a very, very different set of circumstances. So,
Leor, I think this is a good time to segue into this New York Times Magazine article, which I think many of us will agree is the first really good article about this to come out. And it's by Nicholas Confessore, who I do not know. And one of the things that it does well is talking about these understandings of sex and gender. And it is throwing Chase Strangio under the bus, but in a lot of ways, but it talks about this conflict between arguing that there's sex discrimination and these more recent arguments from this sort of activist wing of trans rights people that there's no such thing as sex, that there's all this conflict within this. And the comment that you made that Ben mentioned right before we started recording was that you thought the article had this subversive side to it that people might not be picking up on. Mm-hmm. I mean, for me, it was the first time I felt like I could send an article to people and say, you're going to start to get an understanding of what I have been talking about nonstop for 5 years. Right. I mean, this is definitely a shift in tone from the New York Times. I think it's just a much, much better piece than what we've seen in recent years, maybe with the exception of Pamela Paul's otherwise excellent articles. Yeah, I mean, so when I say subversive, I mean that, of course, in quotation marks. I mean, it's subversive in the sense that it dares to ask questions that, just to be perfectly frank, Azim Goraishi dares not ask. Mm-hmm. Questions about the fundamental concepts controlling the field of gender medicine, sex, gender identity, questions about the clinical rationale. These are areas that, questions of what does it even mean? I don't think Confessore gets into the question of what it means to say that there's a transgender child. Maybe I'm misremembering. I don't think he gets into that.
No.
But at least it hints in that direction, right? Because if the core terms that he says have had their meanings shift in recent years in ways that do not reflect even the liberal consensus, let alone kind of a more scientific one, I think you could put two and two together and say, okay, so what does it mean to say that some kids are born with a gender identity that's misaligned with the sex that they were assigned at birth? Isn't that pseudoscience? Does that really make sense to talk? Does it really make sense to talk that way? So that I appreciated that because I think if you don't recognize that these core terms are really at the heart of the debate, it's not as I think in some of Azim Quraishi's writings, I think you sometimes get the sense that these are just peripheral matters. These are the culture war stuff. The really important stuff is the medicine and what the experts say. No, these are the fundamental questions. What are we medicalizing and why? And if you don't get into those questions, that's the very definition of missing the forest for the trees. And so that's, one reason that I really appreciated this article. Another reason is, I think the story really deserves to be told. And I know that other people Ben, I'm sure that you have stuff about this, and Lisa, maybe you're getting into it in your book as well. What happened in the world of gay rights activism? What happened in the world of LGBT organizations that led to this drift into this very, very controversial, illiberal, anti-consensus, radical politics direction? And Confessore brings that out a little bit when he quotes kind of the star attorney at the ACLU, Chase Strangio, saying things like, "I'm a constitutional lawyer who doesn't believe in the Constitution."
Yes.
Or I think that what did Strangio say? I think that civil law or the courts are fundamentally a violent institution. I mean,
I think marriage he's called violent.
Marriage,
Yes.
right. That marriage is a fundamentally violent institution. I mean, this is how kind of snarky first-year undergraduates who have just been exposed for the first time to queer theory and have not given this any thought and are just kind of intoxicated, and I use that word advisedly, intoxicated by not just by new ideas, but by this kind of new way of speaking that's so subversive and cool. And it's like Strangio has never emerged out of the undergraduate seminar. This is classic dorm room Marxism, right? And there's a place for it. I'm not saying there isn't. It's fun to do these kinds of intellectual exercises in college, but my God, when this is the one of the lead attorneys at the nation's most important legal advocacy organization that has an enormous amount of power over culture and law and policy and institutions, I think this is a real crisis for American liberalism.
I think you bring up a really good point there because, first, at the beginning of the article, when it says in Nicholas's article, when it says something like, Nicholas Confessore consulted with LGBT rights activists, with the Biden members of the Biden administration, with ACLU lawyers, with civil rights lawyers, etc. It said nothing about and consulted. It was all people who would support at least some kind of gender affirming care for minors, most likely. I mean, it sounded like it was all proponents of these practices. And I was a little bit disappointed when I read that preface because I was like, okay, well, here we go. But what I think actually it ended up really working is because it was using all of their own words to unpack what has occurred within this world, and really getting down to, so no, did he get to well, what is a transgender child, or hey, how does one distinguish between a gay child and a trans child? He doesn't go into that. I guess we're just not there yet in that subversiveness of the conversation, but it did really help because it was using all of those organizations' own words, and I think it would have hindered the piece in the eyes of a lot of New York Times readers if it was using the words of people who were opposed to it. So that's a really good thing. But you brought up I do write about that exactly in my book about what happened to the LGBT organizations. But you bring up a good point in that Strangio has not exited the queer studies undergraduate seminar, and using that language, but this is all part and parcel of young people, of radicals, and of children leading the way. I mean, children are leading the way. Joanna Wilson Kennedy, children should lead the way. I mean, it's all about Diana Aronsaft. Children are leading in this. That came out in the Washington Post article in 2018. Diana Aronsaft was saying that
Right.
children are now leading the way. They have no gender or some gender, a little bit of this gender and a little bit of that gender, and
Right.
so Sarah Kate Ellis has spoken in interviews, who is the president of GLAAD, has spoken in interviews about kids leading the way. She looks to young people to see what is the next vanguard, and she follows obsessively the discourse on social media and what they're saying, and look how they've completely retracted from X and gone into this bubble of blue sky, which is pretty much like Tumblr for adults, and you know and is following their lead. So this is all
Right.
part and parcel of that whole project of following young radicals and young ideals, and the young ideals of young radical people. But this does go back. What I didn't know when I started researching this and learning about this was that I didn't know that this actually went back decades. I mean, obviously, this, arguments in the academy about knowledge production and epistemology and queer theory or postmodernism's insertion into epistemology and the study of history and so on, and truth and knowledge dates back to, like the 80s, and then it really took off in the night. There were all of these things that really, but this bled into activist organizations. So it kind of, I write this in my book, like these organizations kind of became mirror images of gender studies departments in academia. And, you know, it, people talk a lot about like, well, did feminism birth this kind of ideology? And while it's not as reductive and simple as that, feminists did play a big part in LGBT organizations by pushing out the patriarchal white males who they found were hindering progress in dismantling the patriarchy, and started introducing quotas, race quotas, gender quotas, in terms of how many people can be represented and so on. And this goes back to the 90s. So people who were that was when they started really solidifying around this radical progressive left wing politics and completely discarding any kind of centrism or conservatism, which used to be a part of this. That's how, when we got to gay marriage and what we were writing on was the impetus, the wave that had been pushed forward by people who understood the pragmatism of compromise and of bipartisanship and understanding all of it. That is the final remnant. That's the final, that was it. It crested, and then it was all, now the radicals are here. They're at the helm. They've been at the helm. You assholes have gotten what you wanted, this violent institution of marriage. Now we can get to the kids. We'll let the kids lead. Let's have this new consumer base, this huge consumer base who, is there to, and that was it. I mean, it is complex and there's a lot more variables that go into it, but that is a big part of it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would maybe push back against here is, I'm not even sure you would disagree with me, is that it's the child-led approach is, of course, not really child-led, right? Because the kids who are saying to their parents, I was assigned male at birth, but I'm actually this, that, and the other, and my gender identity is, whatever, and I'm queer. I mean, all of the language and the concepts that they use to make sense of their feelings and experiences and the world around them are given to them by adults.
Right.
Correct.
And specifically by kind of adults in positions of authority in the cultural milieu that they belong to. And that very well could include kind of the network that makes up the ACLU, and local GSA clubs or whatever, right? That kind of stuff. So what the kids are doing is they're parroting back to the adults language that they absorbed through osmosis from the culture they live in. And then you have kind of these Arensaf types who in their naivete are just kind of entranced by this. And they think that they're seeing kind of the voice of God spoken through a child. How does if a 3-year-old child tells us that their gender is really different and they're insistent, persistent, consistent, this must be natural.
Right.
So in other words, they don't even see the product of their own work in these.
They also, I mean, speaking of the ACLU's, HRC's GLAD, they don't even see that they are the ones who are perpetuating and instilling the distress and suicidality in a lot of these kids.
Right.
So if I tell a child over and over again, this is going to cause you pain, you are going to feel hurt from this, this causes suicide, oh my God, people are after you, they're coming to get you, children are going to feel that distress. They're creating the problem, which then they are claiming that they have the solution for as well.
Of course. And so that makes it all the more cynical, right?
Yes. And evil
and sinister.
Yes, there's a sinisterness to it. Going back to what you said though, Ben, the one thing that I find so interesting regarding Strangio is Strangio doesn't only, say the fundamental violent institution of civil marriage, but also said, his complaints about the LGBT movement that she was saying I'm coming in to fix is she's saying that all of the social power, capital, and political power were with white gay men. Mm-hmm. And if I had no idea who Chase Strangio was, and I saw Chase Strangio on the street and interacted with her, I would say that is a white gay male.
What?
I would, from the voice, the inflection, yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
I think Strangio could pass as a white gay male, most likely, and she would be very happy to hear that, as she's tweeted in the past about an anecdote where she was called a faggot by someone who was blocking her driveway. She said that that was affirming, because yes, that's true. That was affirming my identity. Well, that's what I have to say to you about being affirmed by the word faggot.
But is Nick giving Chase too much, power here? This did not just come from
No, and I don't think Nick's argument is that Chase kind of, bullied the ACLU into this outcome. I don't think that's the argument. I think the argument is that the ACLU, for its own reasons, elevated Strangio to a position of authority and lacked the resources, both intellectual and moral and maybe even financial, to push back, to kind of restore, to pull the ACLU back to somewhat of a more moderate position. And this, I think, speaks to kind of the broader shift on the political or cultural left over the recent decade towards intersectionality, towards theories of, this goes back to what Ben was talking about, theories of subjugated knowledges. That's the academic term, right? That the more oppressed you are, the more your claims of knowledge should be considered valid, which I think is kind of the most interesting and in some ways most serious and troubling aspects of the encroachment of postmodernism, queer theory, all that kind of stuff into liberal politics, liberal culture. It's the claims about knowledge, what we can know and why. And Strangio really embodies that type of activism. And so I think the article is really trying to say, ACLU became its own worst enemy, and there was nobody within the world of the groups, right? The kind of the liberal ecosystem of organizations, nonprofits, donors. Nobody was able or willing to restrain them, and so they ended up making this massive strategic mistake of taking this case to the Supreme Court. Now, my theory, and I know that some people may have other theories, my theory is that a big part of the story is that there was, identity politics has come to be a professional class pursuit. It's no longer, if you think that, let's say, 1960s civil rights organizing was a form of identity politics, you could at least say that there was a strong correlation between Black identity and a kind of an economic underclass, right? So the identity group was almost coterminous with a socially and economically marginalized group. But I think in today's world, identity is really kind of a professional class obsession, and its primary manifestation is in being visible, being seen, being celebrated in your professional status, in your professional milieu. Jack Turbin is another very good example of this, right? I think he had that New England Journal of Medicine article that he wrote a few years ago about what it's like to be a gay person, medical student at Harvard. I mean, this is all kind of it's all a matter of personal performance and standing on top of the most prestigious institutions in the United States and saying, look at me, I'm marginalized, but look at how incredibly successful I am as a marginalized person within the kind of the highest echelons of American society. And so my theory is that a large part of why the ACLU pursued this case is because they could not withstand, they were too tempted by the headline of first transgender lawyer argues before the Supreme Court justices. And Chase wanted to be that person. Chase wanted to go down in history as being the first transgender person who argues before the Supreme Court, which, if you are, to use kind of the trans movement's own logic here, if you are a disabled Black trans sex worker, what do you care about who the first trans person to argue before the Supreme Court is? What you're concerned about is, am I going to survive my next encounter with a client? How do I gain access to healthcare for HIV and AIDS and stuff like that, right? You don't care about who the first person to argue before the Supreme Court is. That's almost by definition a professional class desire or interest. So I really think that is played a major role in why the ACLU decided to pursue this case, because I can't see anybody at the ACLU seriously thinking that they can come away with a win here.
Well, I think for many, how ironic that the person who, becomes the first trans lawyer to go this far also was sort of is the person to herald in the end of this wave of activism, the end of the success. But I also think there was no reason to stop, because for so long there was just win after win after win. And why quit now? Why quit while you're ahead when all the obstacles are cleared? And when you made this really good point, Leor, about, people like Aaron Saft were talking about Believe the Children and child-led. And of course, that was Believe the Children was also a satanic panic statement. And Aaron Saft also believed the children during the satanic panic. But it's not really child-led, because not only is it coming from the adults, but it's coming from the advocacy groups who train the teachers, who train the doctors, who continue to train the journalists. So, Ben says it starts in the academy with third wave feminism, which I'm too old for. I knew nothing about it. It was not happening very much when I was in college, but queer theory, postmodernism, third wave feminism, then it runs the advocacy groups, and then those advocacy groups train the professional class. And this is incredibly popular, especially when it intersects with social media, where the most outlandish kind of ideas gain the most purchase. And I mean that in more than one way. And it's profitable. I mean, What more could you want? Popular and profitable, right? So as we see from, my Pride banner here in Zoom, I mean, there was no reason not to. And then it turned into incredible pressure to participate, that if you didn't celebrate Pride, in my most favorite song, which was my non-gender pick of the week, one week, which was Bo Burnham's That Funny Feeling, and he has this line about bugles take on race, and that, no matter how crazy it is, the pretzel companies or the chip companies have to weigh in politically. So there's popularity, there's profit, and there's pressure. And whatever this ruling means, there certainly has been a shift. Like there is an acknowledgement, especially in the past week and a half in the New York Times for the first time, that we went too far. And I think one of the questions is, how far back are we going to go now?
Yes.
Because most of us liberals who have been talking about this very openly for the past 4 years have been saying, if we don't fix it, they will do it to us.
Yes.
And we don't know now. We don't know how far back it's going. And back to the court case, what I find interesting, because obviously it went too far, did not reach the liberal justices. And the last 4 or 5 rulings, they all were unanimous, right? But this one broke down along party lines. And I just wonder if you have thoughts about that. I mean, because this continues to be an issue that is different from all others, that the people, that the liberals and gays and lefties who communed with the right wing are heretics, whereas you might be celebrated for being bipartisan on any other issue. This is the hardest issue. And these ostensibly very smart people, because they got to the Supreme Court, well, maybe they're not that smart, as you pointed out, but they couldn't get over the partisanship to move in a way that even the New York Times, which was stuck in that mode itself, has started to move of we went too far.
Before Leor, you answer, I will just put out there, I will buy anybody a beer, because I do think when this gets back up to the court again, Kagan might eventually come over.
Well, she's probably the most moderate and thoughtful of the liberals there. Sorry. Apologies for that noise. It's not me. I didn't do anything.
Are the police at your door?
Well, I did speak some heresies on this podcast, but it is an informed dissent podcast. So that's
right.
It's not mere dissent. It's informed dissent.
You're not over in England today.
Right. Yeah, I think Kagan is probably the candidate who's most likely to express some skepticism of kind of her tribe's position. I've been humbled enough times on this question of why thoughtful, intelligent people who are liberals or Democrats on this issue just kind of abandon their critical thinking skills, and just kind of buy into ideas that on some level they must know are just false and harmful. And I sometimes wonder if we're overthinking it. If it might not be more complicated than, Sotomayor and Ketanji Brown Jackson, and maybe even Kagan, truly believe that this is just gay rights 2.0, right? They don't want to be caught on the wrong side of a new civil rights issue. They know that gay people had to kind of, fight uphill and gain acceptance and understanding. And there were a lot of people who initially did not extend that acceptance and understanding who now do and regret it. And it's embarrassing for them if they travel within kind of liberal circles. And they say, you know what, I don't want to be caught on the wrong side of this. I'm just kind of going to hold my finger up to the wind. And it seems like the right side of history, and that term to me always means the right side of progressive public opinion as distilled by the New York Times. That's what history means. The right side of history is to acknowledge that trans kids exist, that, that some of them need life-saving medical care. The right side of history, Lisa, and I think this is something that you have taught me in this fight in particular, and that is that liberals are the kind of people who just trust institutions. They trust experts. They cannot, for the life of them, fathom the possibility that the entire medical establishment, as represented by, powerful medical associations, got this one wrong. It's inconceivable. And when you add to that Republicans are on the other side of this, that seals the deal. And I think the liberal judges, it's not much more complicated than that. It's trans kids are real. They're gay kids 2.0. All the experts are telling me that I should, defer to them. Institutions matter. And the Republicans are on the other side. And that's all. I don't need to know much more than that. And I think that's reflected in the very, very poor reasoning that you see from Sotomayor, because, I've read dissents by liberal justices in cases that, the conservative majority carried. And sometimes you get really powerful dissents where you're left saying, all right, I initially agreed with the majority, but now I'm not so sure. This is one of those cases where you're just left dumbfounded. How can they be so thick? How can they say these types of things?
Yeah, well, this is a really good, you're bringing up a really good point. Well, first of all, we have had a word for this for a while, libtard. I mean, that exists for a reason. That's been in the, our in the discourse for a long time. But, the thing is that you started off by talking about Sotomayor and how just kind of really stupid and the reasoning was for this. You talk about not understanding how Democrats or people that support this aren't exercising critical thinking about this. You talk about what this shows is, and I've spoken about this before, I believe on this podcast, these radical ideas that have trickled down, let's say from academia, right? But then were dumbed down on Tumblr and then spread out, and just passed back and forth like telephone to make it all the way to Sotomayor's dissent, their sad dissent in the Supreme Court decision. You know, these are stupid. These are very basic, fundamental, simple, stupid ideas couched in impenetrable jargon that makes them seem smarter than they are. We've known this. We know this. I mean, who was it that wrote a piece in the 90s on Judith Butler's The Sophistry of Judith Butler, and how you see this, it's this impenetrable jargon that's so elitist that's like, oh, I'm not smart enough to understand that, but I believe it. I believe the ideas that come out of it because I am not smart enough to understand. Just like these experts at the AAP, I trust them because I am not smart enough to understand this science. And so when you look at this, like the science, like we do, you look at the studies, when you analyze what Judith Butler's actually saying, you're like, this makes absolutely no sense. It is nonsensical. And wherever there is a thread of sense, it's profoundly stupid. So this is so naturally kids are going to pick up on this because what is it besides stupid? It's seductive. I mean, it's about fighting oppression. It's about, it's about upending and what Alejandra Caraballo, whatever. I mean, I can't imagine, someone took a screenshot of whether it was a tweet or whatever they called those things on Blue Sky, a bluesy, I don't know. Like, we should just let America burn and see what rises from the ashes, right? Right. And this is someone that's regularly quoted as an expert, but I don't believe that Chase Strangio thinks very differently from that. And a lot of people in the academy and a lot of people that are radicalizing these young people, that is what this is built upon. We are a cis white Christian, white supremacist imperialist nation that needs to be brought to its knees, a capitalist nation that needs to be brought to its knees, and a utopian socialism needs to arise out of it.
But we still hate the Jews.
But yes.
Ben, I just want to say I often use the word beguiling when I'm talking about gender identity because I think it beguiled a generation. But I think seductive is also a really, really good word, not just for the sort of power through powerlessness. And that you're part of this incredible social movement, but that the whole idea of excavating this pureness inside you, I mean, and becoming your own God and overwriting God. I always talk about it as making each person becomes their own God, and they become Adam and Eve. I mean, it makes each person so powerful. And I also think it's why people get so upset about it, because you are interrupting the origin story of humanity, and in part by creating intersex conditions and otherwise healthy people, but messing with the story. You're messing with the story of Genesis. And for some people, that's really upsetting. And as you say, Ben, for some people, that's incredibly seductive. And I just want to say how much I like that word.
Mhm. Especially
Yeah,
because
especially so when, yeah, go ahead.
go ahead. No, please, Leor.
I was just going to say, especially so when, in what other contexts do children get empowered to dictate to adults how they can talk, how they can think, what they can do and say? I don't think there's another context in which they can do that. This is pretty much the only time that adults have kind of ceded to children total authority over social interactions, and children being kids being kids, especially teenagers, of course are going to take advantage of that. Why wouldn't they? I would have done the same.
You're sitting on Santa's lap and saying, I want a sex change for Christmas. It reminds me of the true origin story of Christmas, which we'll just link to. I won't make everyone listen to it, but it did start as Upside Down Day, when the bosses celebrated the workers, and eventually it turned into, for one day, oh look, I'm telling the story, for one day we would celebrate the children who would otherwise be seen and not heard. I give this lecture to my children every year against their wishes, but we'll link to my piece about Upside Down Day and Christmas. But it is true, it makes everyday Christmas for young people, if your idea, well, and by the way, I remember hearing early on how many parents would, their teenage girls would come home and say, Betsy got a mastectomy, can I get one too?
Okay. Oh, go ahead, Jamie.
Well, I was just going to see, could we segue over to see what are the real world implications and how is Skrmetti going to fall out through, maybe the state landscape next year? And then we could do our non-gender recommendations. And I'll also, speaking of Christmas, Lisa, I got on a Zoom earlier today and immediately somebody said Happy Skrmetti Day and would like us to start, remembering Skrmetti Day next year. Yeah. So Corey, were you going to say something before we?
No, I was going, yes, and your setup there, your segue, Jamie. So what comes after Skrmetti? And what happens, first of all, what happens in Tennessee? Is this done?
You mean in terms of legal proceedings in the state?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I'm actually not sure.
Or in Arkansas, because Arkansas has been on hold. It should.
Right. So, and presumably the Supreme Court in these situations returns the case down to the lower courts that then resolve it. Because the courts of appeal in our system are supposed to settle questions of law and not of fact. And lawsuits are questions of law and fact, right? Especially like when you're kind of what's called in public law litigation, which is where you challenge a law that's essentially a policy. In terms of the ramifications of this case, I mean, your guess is pretty much as good as mine. I mean, I don't think it's going to have a tremendous amount of reach beyond the question of whether it's constitutionally permissible for states to pass age restriction laws, which of course is a very important question. So this case presumably is not going to have much impact in blue states, although there is this kind of adjacent question in the world of insurance, both public and private, about whether or why insurance carriers have to cover these procedures. And so far, the argument that has been made in order to require, sometimes not against their will, but in accordance with their will, to require insurance companies to cover surgeries and hormones is because it's discrimination if they don't. And so, even though Skrmetti was not technically about, for example, Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act, I think it sends a very strong signal to the lower courts that, if we get a case on 1557, this is how we're also likely to resolve that.
Which was the clause, just for the people playing along at home, which was the clause that said you cannot discriminate based on, I believe it says based on gender identity, not just sex.
No, it
just says sex.
The law says sex because it basically imports Title IX into healthcare law. But the Obama and later Biden administrations issued a rule or interpretations and later a rule saying that sex means gender identity. And they used that clause to tell the insurance industry, you must cover these procedures, because if you don't, you're discriminating on the basis of sex. So you can see how the Skrmetti reasoning, even though it didn't technically apply to that scenario, could be used in that scenario. And it's anybody's guess how insurance companies are going to respond to that. And that in part has to do with, what other interests and incentives they have in this, and not just a matter of legal compliance. So will this case have implications for blue states? Possibly, not directly so, but maybe indirect implications. And we can, there are a lot of times where court cases have unexpected outcomes. I'm reminded of Roe versus Wade, created the modern kind of, religious conservative movement in American politics and completely changed the face of American politics. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, to some extent, predicted that when she said that it was a strategic mistake for the court to decide Roe versus Wade. So sometimes court cases have political consequences that are far more significant and consequential than the narrow legal issues that they settle. And it remains to be seen if Skrmetti is of that nature. I don't think so, but we'll see.
I have some hope just in some of the states where I've testified, the other side was using this court case. They were saying things like, oh, if you pass this ban, it's going to be challenged right away. And the Supreme Court, Skrmetti hasn't been ruled on. We don't know. You're wasting the taxpayers' time and money, because if you pass this law, it won't be upheld. I do think it gives us it at least buys us out of one of their arguments. It gives us an easy, oh no, this has already been decided. You can pass this ban. It passes muster.
Right.
So in some
Yeah,
ways,
and like I said, I said this to the Free Press yesterday or the day before. I hope that a second order effect of this lawsuit is to draw more public attention to the underlying issue itself. And it could very well have that consequence. It could also have the opposite consequence of making people who otherwise would be open to considering the medical and ethical issues more inclined to think about this in kind of the abstract language of rights, to kind of blame the Supreme Court and the conservative majority, to focus more on the politics than on the underlying medical issues. Like, I'm sad to say a lot of New York Times coverage on this issue until Confessore's piece, a lot of their coverage has been just kind of dabbling in the medical controversy, and then, spending 80% of the article talking about the politics of it. I hope, not too optimistic, but I hope that maybe Skrmetti changes the calculus a little bit, so that people at mainstream liberal outlets who are technically on this beat will start digging a little bit deeper on the medical issues, and not just being obsessed with how they play out politically.
Not to prolong this too long, but speaking of the medical issues and pulling away and opening up that dialogue, when we're talking about Sotomayor's dissent, when we're talking about these opinions and the way it was argued before the court, everybody takes for granted or presupposes that what is true is that you can induce an opposite sex puberty in a child's body. So you can induce a female puberty in a male's body,
yes.
or you can induce a male puberty in a female's body. They also presuppose that, and this has been presupposed for a long time, and I don't think it necessarily was brought up here, but that you pause puberty, and that regardless of when you commence it, if you've taken off blockers, that puberty will commence as normal. So when they talk about comparing this to precocious puberty, it's like the glaring obvious difference is these kids eventually go through puberty,
Right.
at a normal, typical window in their timeline of their life.
Right.
What we're talking about is permanently impeding kids from going through puberty. And they say, well, that's not true. We're putting them through the right puberty. No, you cannot manufacture an opposite sex. Now, I say, no, you cannot induce an opposite sex puberty in a body. That's true, right? I mean, am I talking out my ass, or is
not,
it?
but I saw somebody tweet this also, because I don't know who wrote it in the but they were saying, somebody wrote, basically, you could induce a female puberty in a male, and somebody tweeted out, "Oh, I'm sorry, since when can men menstruate?
Right.
When will boys ever menstruate? They won't." Like it's not some simple, Corey.
Yeah, keep going.
Oh, yeah.
But yes, you're right, Ben. Everyone in there does not go well into the medicine.
But also like puberty is not just the sum total of physiological changes in the body. It's a very complicated interaction between physiology, psychology, and how a kid starts to relate to his peers, to society.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's all of that stuff together is what we call puberty, going through puberty. I mean, when we talk about puberty in our normal kind of day-to-day, language, we don't just mean, your genitals are changing and you're now able to produce sperm. When we say something like, oh, yeah, the kid is being really difficult at school, it must be because they're going through puberty. We don't mean it's because simply that their hormones are flushing their bodies now. We mean that is causing certain psychological conditions, that correlates to social experiences, them struggling to figure out how to fit in, how to be respectful, how to be deferential to authority, when to challenge it, all these kinds of things. So, the physical and the psychological and the social are so linked together in such a complicated way. I mean, it just shows you the hubris of thinking that you can just take a syringe and take a kid and put them in a situation where they're going through the puberty of the opposite sex. I mean, even if you could completely mimic on a physiologic level the puberty of the opposite sex, which you can't, exactly for the reason you just said, Jamie, even if you could do that, they would still not technically be going through a female puberty. They would be going through some kind of hybrid male-female puberty, the consequences of which we don't even begin to understand. These are the kind of the basic questions that, to me, are at the center of this debate, and that, I'm thankful that even though Confessore's piece didn't explicitly get into them, it at least hints in that direction and says, look, we can't ignore these fundamental issues. They're not accidental, they're fundamental.
The element, right, and the element of puberty that for me always drives back to sexuality and orientation and gender nonconformity, and most of these kids is because it's part of that interplay of your peer group and your budding sexuality, and that you start to understand, those roles, and that's when a lot of gay people really come to understand who they are. I mean,
right. So I would like, for example, anybody who supports, let's call it the supposedly cautious approach to youth gender medicine, right? The one that says, oh, we can, through assessment, we can pick out the good candidates from the bad. I would like somebody, a proponent of that position, to explain to me, how can a kid know that the distress that they have associated with their emerging puberty is because they're destined to become a lifelong transsexual as opposed to they're gay, if they haven't had a single sexual experience? How is that possible? It doesn't even register within the realm of possibility to me. It seems to me that having several sexual experiences, and we can get,
now we're getting into dangerous territory.
Right. But
it's true though. How do you know M. Gesson wrote that stupid piece, and one of the first sentences was, don't even ask trans people how they know that they're trans, just like you don't even ask Black people how they know they're Black, or gay people how they know they're gay,
or Jewish people how they know they're Jewish.
I know I'm gay because of how my physiological body responds,
and I know I'm Jewish because of the jokes my grandfather told me.
Yes, but
all right, let's move it. Let's
do our non-gender
if anybody
thing.
is willing to talk to Leor about that, I hope they'll comment. And
thank you, Leor. Thank you so much for coming on.
Leor.
Okay, I'm gonna do my Corey, you do your non-gender thing first.
Why are you picking on me?
You look like you had to leave. Okay, I'll do mine. It's high gardening season right now. Which is so I love this part of the year, right before everything starts to be pickable and ready to start eating things. I just wanted to give a shout out to tomato cages this week. They are life-changing, and I need two more, and I need two tomato cages. Yes, and also if anybody wants spearmint, I have like copious amounts of spearmint, and if we can figure out a way for me to dry it, I will mail it to you.
This is the closest I get to gardening, but whatever.
Okay, that's mine. Tomato.
Mine is this book. I don't think I recommended it already, and I finished it last night. And I also discovered something very exciting, which is that my name is in the acknowledgments, which I did not know. But I love Megan's new book. She is the best. She is the best, most muscular essayist in America.
Megan Dom's The Catastrophe Hour, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, right. That's right. I forgot some people listen.
Leor, how about you? What do you got for us?
Well, I thought that you meant like in terms of reading recommendations.
Anything.
So
it can be anything non-gender.
Okay, anything non-gender. So one thing that's gender adjacent, but I think is much, much wider and more and kind of gets to some of the issues that we were discussing, you were discussing today, Ben, is the book Identity by Francis Fukuyama. It's, I mean, there are things I quibble with in that book, but on the whole, it's a short and very engaging read that kind of gives us a really good introduction to why we are where we are. If somebody wants to nerd out like me on why courts are uniquely bad institutions for making public policy, I recommend this book, The Courts and Social Policy by Donald Horowitz. It's an old book, but really, really good, especially for the judicial skeptics out there. And then one last book is because, when I think about this issue, I'm always thinking about groups and interests and incentives and not just ideas. I think there's a kind of a natural inclination to get sucked into ideas, which is important, don't get me wrong. But thinking about structures and incentives and things like that are also very important. So it reminds me that this is a really good book about teacher unions. It's called Special Interests by Terry Moe. And it's a long and a bit of a heavy book, but it's fascinating. It kind of walks through what teachers unions are, why they have so much power, and why their interests are almost always at odds with the interests of students. So anyway, those are my recommendations.
Okay.
Love it. Love
Ben
it.
and Corey.
Ben and Corey.
Corey, what do you got?
Well, it's not really a recommendation this week because I don't have one, but I'm telling you something that I'm interested in researching. So I'm gonna start doing some investigation in this and I'll report back. But I picked up a set of 3 books this week, which I'm all digital, so maybe I'll have a chance to get through them pretty quickly. One of them is Lost Christianities, The Battle for Scripture and the Faiths We Never Knew. One is The Gnostic New Age, How a Countercultural Spirituality Revolutionized Religion from Antiquity to Today, and Orthodoxy and Heresy in Early Christian Contexts, Reconsidering the Bauer Thesis. So I am plugging into the first 3 centuries or so of Christianity, trying to figure out what that looked like, because I'm very interested in understanding some phenomenon that I see today in at least American churches, and I want to get a sense of how far back some of the stuff might go.
Cool.
And so if anybody else has recommendations that should be on that list, let me know.
I might actually, Corey, because I took a really good Christianity class at Columbia by this great professor, Robert Somerville, and it was a huge overview of early Christianity, and I learned so much that I never knew. So I might have some recommendations for you there. On Leor's note about identity and Francis Fukuyama, it reminded me of this book as well, Fashionable Nonsense.
Yeah.
Postmodern Intellectuals' Abuse of Science. It's written by Alan Sokal and Jean Brickmont. They're 2 professors of physics. Brickmont's theoretical physics, and Alan Sokal's physics. Very good explainer, enjoyable kind of breakdown of how stupid these ideas are. Well, I think that's it. Again, Leor, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you guys for having me. I love this podcast. I can never recommend it enough. So I was honored to be invited.
Thank you.
Very, very happy. And everyone have a great week, and we will see you all next week.
Right.
Sounds good.